At the outset, I'd like to recognize up front that this really represents the support of many funding bodies and collaboration of numerous healthcare colleagues and agencies and colleagues from a number of universities in different disciplines as well. So it has a very interdisciplinary focus. It's not solely a nursing focus, and it's to the credit of all of the people who've contributed to this work that it is what it is. As everyone here knows, there are many opportunities contained in the potential for optimizing healthy aging simply because our whole population, global-wide, is aging. And 83% of people 65 years and older have at least one chronic disease. Increasingly, there is comorbidity, and most people 65 and over have 2 to 3 chronic diseases. And that incidence is growing as the population ages. It's also a known fact that 30% of the population uses 90% of healthcare resources. So along with the social and moral and ethical imperative to optimize healthy aging, there is the capitalistic opportunity of conserving our precious health resources too. So it's a real opportunity to focus in this direction. There are some challenges though, and I would say that the greatest challenge is that while most of us, if not all of us around this table, would espouse the notion of health as a resource for everyday living, in reality, society in general and the healthcare system specifically identifies health as the absence of disease, or at best, as a state of complete mental, physical, and social well-being, right? And so the opportunity for optimizing health in later life as the population ages and confronts the challenge of physical frailty and multiple chronic diseases, the opportunity, if we focus only on health as the absence of disease or a state of complete mental, physical, and social well-being, is very constrained. The opportunity is more constrained if we stop to think about how we societally envision healthy aging. And from my perspective at least, and I think from a lot of the literature too, you will see that we tend to envision healthy aging as independence, a state of independence. And any digression from health and aging as being linked to dependence. We haven't gone very well to the notion of healthy interdependence in later life, and to the acceptance of the reality that maybe interdependence is a good thing. So that's a challenge in terms of optimizing healthy aging in an aging population. The thoughts that I bring to you are based on 20 years of programmatic research, and I've counted up 23 studies and maybe have done 1 or 2 solo. Most of them have been, as I said up front, collaborative interdisciplinary undertakings or work with graduate students from a diversity of disciplines, not just nursing. And over the course of those 20 years, the input that I have to share with you has come from almost 3,000 older people, about 1,000 professional providers and paraprofessional providers too of differing backgrounds and disciplines, and a goodly number of family or informal caregivers. I started it all with phenomenological research. I was exploring the experience of making the transition from hospitalization for acute episodes of chronic disease flare-up, if you will, to in-home care provided by our home care infrastructure. And at that time, it was a huge undertaking. It wasn't small-scale phenomenology. It was large social phenomenology, large scale. And I followed a number of frail, chronically ill seniors at time of discharge from a small community hospital, about 230 beds, to a more small community/rural context for in-home care. And a number discharged from the academic teaching hospital in a larger urban setting to the more urban context of home care. And, you know, these were all people over 65. The oldest was 100 years old, and the average age was 76.6, I believe. So they weren't young, older people. And I chain sampled their providers in both contexts, in the hospital and in the home care sector, all of the caregivers involved in their experience of transition, and also their family caregivers. So I had a huge mountain of data, and of course, as you can imagine, uncovered all of the communication and coordination challenges that lead to older people falling into what we call the cracks in the system between sectors of healthcare. But what really hit me, and what really has taken me to this whole focus on optimizing healthy aging, were the older people's stories of disempowerment in the context of the hospital. When they were hospitalized, they said what happened to them was that professional providers and family caregivers alike, all very well-intended, well-meaning, took charge, managed their health care problems and issues, and even their larger life management issues, in the case of family. And the older people describe that as very much undermining of their self-confidence and even their interest and enthusiasm for being involved in managing their own life and health on a day-to-day basis. So it was a reaction, if you will, to our best effort to provide care that created an attitude that they conveyed then to, in turn, to us as their professional providers and to their families, which only motivated professionals and informal caregivers alike to take more control, to help out more, right? So it created kind of a downward spiral of disempowerment that I had not really appreciated before in my role as a nurse. And so I sat down with my colleagues in the healthcare sector, and we talked about this, and I did some reading, and my doctorate is in education, so of course I was inclined to go to the adult education literature and got into Meziro's perspective transformation theory, and put all of this together, and we came up with what they thought might work in terms of trying to engage or re-engage older people discharged from hospital to home in the everyday life and health management focus they had had. And it was a critical reflection process, a la Meziro. And so we envisioned having these older people think out loud and talk to the provider about their life and health, their resources for their life and health, their expectations, enthusiasm, confidence for being involved in their life and health care management, and their ideas of what their goals were for their life and health, and what actions they were taking or might take, and what outcomes they were experiencing. And so they just talked. Just talk. That's all they were to do. And when we actually tested out this intervention, we had, much to the chagrin of the epidemiologists on the team, we had the intervention nurses. They were experienced community nurses hired specifically to do this, decide along with the older people how often they would visit for how long, right? You wouldn't just do one, two, you would work with. And so they had on average 10.5 hours, some more than others, some less. And they generally negotiated weekly visits that phased to bi-weekly. So they had about 12 to 16 visits over about 22 weeks. And as their research collaborators, we got funding for a randomized control trial of this intervention. And of course, it was an efficacy trial, i.e., doing it in the ideal scenario where you had specially studied trained nurses sitting on their hands because they were used to doing 2 and 4 people in the home, and they found that a little bit of a change, and engaging the older people in this way. And we randomized just under 300 frail, chronically ill older people. On average, they had 2.3 chronic diseases. And we randomized them at time of discharge from hospital to home care. And the intervention group got the usual in-home services that would have been prescribed in any case, plus this time to talk with a study nurse. And the other half, the usual in-home services only, and they served as a control. So that was our RCT. Now, because of my interest in interpretive research, I also built in a phenomenological study of their experience of that health promotion intervention. So in the RCT, we measured them at baseline and again immediately after the intervention, both groups of course at the same time, and then again 1 year later. And we found that those who had spent that extra 10.5 hours simply talking about their life and health and their vision for life and health actually had significantly greater independence, greater perceived ability to manage their own health, greater quality of life. They were asking had lower desire for information because they were asking more questions and getting the answers they needed. That's what we found from the qualitative piece. And lo and behold, in the 1 year follow-up, those who had spent this extra time focusing on optimizing their health through critical reflection spent 8.2 fewer days in hospital and used overall fewer in-home services, even when we counted in the extra superimposed hours of the intervention. So we felt we had some good information there. From the phenomenological piece, what we did here was get the informed consent of the RCT participants in the randomized controlled trial. And for those who gave informed consent, we audio taped all of their sessions. And from those, we selected out information-rich cases. And as you can see, on average, they were just under 78 years. And we selected out people who reflected both sexes and a diversity of chronic disease. So we could say this is the experience of health promotion for chronic disease in general, not one specific chronic disease. And because they were information-rich cases, they had a few more sessions, right? And we also, as the study unfolded, met the intervention nurses and those of us leading the research team, and audio taped the meetings of their experience of the sessions and had their field notes as well. So again, not of data from which we were able to discern that for older people with chronic disease, health simply means being able to do what I want to do on a day-to-day basis. And if you think about it, that fits with our current understanding of health as a resource for everyday living. And it explains why older people often rate themselves as having very good to excellent health despite chronic disease, right? This is how they see health, not as the absence of disease or even the absence of physical frailty. The health promotion process was much more than critical reflection. What we saw going on here was a simultaneous process of relationship building and increasing conscious awareness of and attention to that older person's larger life and health picture beyond the chronic disease and the illness experience, right? So they were, through talking, thinking out loud and talking about it, they were getting a much greater in-depth shared appreciation of that person's larger life and health experience. And in fact, what we saw over time, and remember I said that relationship building and the conscious awareness and appreciation of health as a resource for everyday living were simultaneous and dynamic and sort of interactive. What we saw here was a building of trust and sort of a mutual meaning of what all of this was about, which was unfolded as a connecting between the two, described by seniors as caring. When it was connecting in the relationship, that's when they described feeling caring. And as that evolved, they seemed to develop a mutual understanding of greater depth and breadth than happens in the usual exchange between health professionals and those with whom they are working. And they connected in a way that allowed them to work together in strategizing around the strengths of the individual and the resources of the individual toward optimizing their health despite chronic illness. So it got beyond the typical health professional focus on disease problem solving to a more strength-based approach. And we published it, and if you want references, I brought a list that I can share with you. We published the model as a dynamic. This really should be a hologram and dancing back and forth. It's not a linear thing, and we found that the nurses' experience changed as well as the clients. Now, we describe this as an empowering partnering process. It's a relational health promotion as opposed to health education, healthy lifestyles programming, or whatever. It's relational health promotion. And empowerment in this approach does not mean that, the individual has a potential for autonomous control. You know, it's not an outcome of the process. Rather, it is the ongoing unfolding of the empowering process of creating an equitable or fair, not equal, balance of the older person's personal knowledge of their life and health with the provider's expert knowledge and the older person's ability for managing their life and health with the professional skills. And not shared decision-making in the predetermined, prescribed approach, but a sharing in the process of decision-making to the extent that the older person has the ability and inclination and will and determination to be involved. So going with that individual. So that's what we mean by empowering partnering. And from all of this, we derive some principles of practice that we were eager to see if they would make a difference. And yes, the approach was client-centered, first and foremost, but more than that, it was into the relationship building piece in a big way. Not communication skills, per se, but the affective, subjective, intersubjective relationship between people and among people. And increasing conscious attention to life and health in the bigger sense, building on strengths and instead of starting with a problem-based, problem-solving approach, and engaging that older person as a partner in care. And I should do a digression in here and say, in the home care sector, they label people for whom they provide service as clients. In some professions, we call them patients. In some different contexts, we call them. I don't think either term works for this, but I use clients because mostly I'm talking to people who use that label. The home care conglomerate with whom we were working in this research decided they wanted to see if they could mount those practice principles and adopt the empowering partnering approach as part of their mission and strategic plan, and mount those principles in their everyday service delivery and care. Well, this is a huge undertaking. They chose to call it flexible client-driven care / service delivery. I have a little dissonance around client-driven because some people seem to think that means, here, you take the steering wheel, you drive. And that's not what this is all about. Going back to the notion of interdependence rather than independence / dependence. But that's what they chose to label it. And you know, people, you have to go with the context when you're doing applied research and work with that. And so we committed to evaluate